In addition to giving composers the ability to preserve a written record of their compositions, musical notation has evolved in order to make it as easy as possible for the performer to read the music. Part of the challenge of notating music, then, is knowing what looks normal and what looks odd. Anything odd-looking will cause the performer to stumble. Let's continue laying out the rules and recommendations for musical notation. In the last lecture, I talked about notating pitches on the 5-note staff. In addition to pitch, musical notes also have a specific starting point and duration. That duration is called the note value, and we show it with note heads, stems, flags, beams, and dots. This note is called an 8th note, at least in the United States. Most notes have at least a note head and a stem. The note head is either solid, like this, or unfilled. The stem either points up or down, depending on where it falls on the 5-line staff. We prefer to have stems not extend too much above or below the staff, so notes high on the staff tend to have their stems point down, and notes low on the staff have stems that point up. The stem is on the right-hand side of the note head when it points up, and on the left-hand side of the note head when it points down. A very common mistake for beginners is to put the downward stem on the wrong side. Flags are added to the stem for 8th notes and all notes shorter than an 8th note. The note with 2 flags is a 16th note, one with 3 flags is a 32nd note, and so on. The flag is always on the right side of the stem, regardless of the stem direction. We often use beams instead of flags when 2 or more flag notes are in a row. In addition to making the music cleaner looking, it tells us how the notes group together within a meter, which we'll discuss when we look at metric notation. Notice that we can group 8th notes and 16th notes together under a single set of beams. In the second group of notes, 2 16th notes and an 8th, the second beam stops at the stem of the second note. In the third set, 16th, 8th, 16th, the second beam only reaches part way after the first 16th and before the last 16th. Beams, even incomplete ones, always point inward. You'll never see a beam hanging out into space at the beginning or ending of a group. Partial beams always point to the left, except for the first one, which can't hang out into space, so it points right. The quarter note has a filled note head and no flag. The half note has an unfilled note head and no flag. We'll never use a flag on an open note head, by the way. The longest note, called a whole note, has an unfilled note head and no stem. All these note values are related as multiples of 2. 2 half notes in a whole note, 2 quarter notes in a half note, and so on. If we do the not very complicated math, we can figure out that there are 4 quarter notes in a whole note, or 8 8th notes in a whole note. Not shown here are 16th notes, but you probably guessed that there are 16 of them in a whole note. You can figure out how many 32nd notes are in a whole note. If we want a duration that is not a multiple of 2, we have 2 ways of doing it. The first way is simply to tie together 2 notes of the same pitch using what's called a tie. Notice that the tie is a curve that stretches from note head to note head on the non-stem side. Since a quarter note is as long as 2 8th notes, when we tie it to an 8th note, it has the length of 3 8th notes. The other, cleaner way to create note values that are not multiples of 2 is to use a dot. A dot adds half the value of a note to itself. So the dotted quarter note shown here is the same as tying half a quarter note, that is an 8th note, to a quarter note. The dotted half note is the same as a half note tied to half its value, which is a quarter note. A dotted 8th note is like tying an 8th note to a 16th note. A dotted whole note would be the same as tying a whole note to a half note. The dot always goes to the right of the note head, regardless of stem direction. A common beginner mistake is to place the dot above, below, or to the left of the note head. Although much less common than single dotted notes, it is also possible to have double dotted notes. A double dotted note is the same as a single dotted note to which half of the half value has been added. So the double dotted quarter note shown here is like a quarter note tied to an eighth note, which is then tied to half an eighth note, which is a 16th note. A double dotted half note would be the same length as a half note tied to a quarter note tied to an eighth note. But don't worry, double dotted notes are relatively rare. Musical notation has a way of specifying the length of silences in the music too. Such silent durations are called rests. For every note value, there is a corresponding rest. Here they are. The eighth rest has the same duration as an eighth note. Usually it's just written like a 7 with a curved crossbar. The 16th note, not shown here, is like a 7 with 2 crossbars. The 32nd rest has 3 top bars, and so on. The quarter rest is a distinctive, hard-to-write squiggle. The half rest looks like a hat, as my childhood piano teacher taught me. Hat and half start with H. She also said that the whole rest looks like wash, starts with W, like whole, hanging from the line. You can remember it however you want. Dotted rests are created exactly the same way as dotted notes. We never tie rests together. Think about why there's no point of doing that.